How many people watched?
So last week, I just kind of got some ideas, and it seemed like the one that seemed to scratch the most itches had to do with the covenant, the idea of a covenant in the Bible. What's a covenant? What are the covenants? Why are they important? How do we understand them? That's a huge concept, and I figure, approaching the topic could be done in a variety of ways, but I figure the kind of walking through the Bible might be sort of the easiest way to go about doing it. And at the same time, scratch some other itches or touch on some other interests people have. Any questions about that? About the topic, about how I'm sort of approaching it. Again, treating this like a Bible study. I'm all for helping people feel more comfortable with the Bible. I think people in general, if you're a regular worshiper or have been for any number of years, you've gotten some familiarity with the Bible through scripture readings on a Sunday morning and through sermons. But when you approach the text by yourself, then it gets a little, then it's, I don't know, people sort of get intimidated by the confusion and sort of how it's written, the language it uses, and then people kind of get tripped up. So over the last several years, I've been a big fan of helping people get comfortable with the Bible. Hello, Linda. You look like you were doing Tai Chi there for a second. So anyway, does that make sense? And then kind of look at the text, but then hit all those other things that people are interested in sort of with the text, like the history, the theology. Why is this important in my life in 2021? My feeling is the purpose of a Bible study is to really kind of bring all of those things together. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Some adult studies could be, we could talk about a topic and then bring in other stuff to hit the topic. I just, my own personal comfort level is, okay, well, let's look at the text and then kind of pull those other things into the text. And then kind of go from there. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it. If y'all have other suggestions or whatever, please, interrupt me. I'm interruptible. Share your thoughts, your interpretations. It's the Bible's a really big library of books. So, make sense? That work for y'all?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Okay,
Sounds
good. All right. So, covenant. When you hear the word covenant, what's like the first thing you think of? How is covenant used probably most often in our culture? When you hear the word covenant, what do you think? It's not a trick question.
Promise.
Okay. And what's one of the biggest promises you make in your life?
Your wedding,
Yeah, marriage covenant, right?
right?
Would y'all say that's probably sort of the biggest, most common use of the word covenant? I mean, we don't talk about making a covenant with T-Mobile when you sign a 2-year contract. But you talk about a covenant of marriage.
Yeah.
And kind of think of everything that kind of goes along with the covenant of marriage. And you sort of get the idea. The concept, I think, really isn't, it's not far-fetched and it's not unusual. We just don't think about it very often, even though we live. If you're married, then you live with it on a daily basis. when I taught world religions, when I did the unit on Judaism, and I was talking about the law, and you got to keep the commandments, and how the Jewish rabbis understood the law in terms of covenant. The ancient rabbis added up in the Old Testament, Torah, okay, added up in the Old Testament, specifically the law, the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Number, Deuteronomy, 613 do's and don'ts. Okay. So when Moses says, follow and obey the ordinances and statutes of the Lord, and you'll live long in the land and prosper, there were 613 ordinances and statutes. Now, what do y'all think of that? What's your reaction to 613?
They have to know all of those.
Theoretically,
Yeah.
It's
Well,
a
there's
lot
probably
to
some-
follow.
Yeah. What else? What else is your other knee-jerk reaction?
it's literally impossible to follow it.
Yeah,
Now, the rabbis believe that no, you probably could, but it'd be very, very, very difficult.
You would get arrested if you followed the Jewish law.
Well,
Because
okay,
you would have to stone your
stoning
children.
adulterers and all that
Yeah,
other fun stuff.
Yeah, you'd have a problem.
Well, you probably wouldn't have to do that law so long as other laws weren't getting broken. But
Okay,
anyway,
if you had a child that never talked back to you, yes, that is correct.
yeah, right. Honor your father and mother. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, 613. Live long in the land and prosper. Now, back to the marriage image. You might be surprised, but the most common metaphor for God's relationship with Israel in the Old Testament is the metaphor of a marriage.
Mhm.
God is the husband, Israel is his spouse, his wife.
Mhm.
And God cares for Israel, his wife. She was down in the gutter, and God pulled her up out of the gutter and dusted her off and made her his prized, I don't want to say possession, but you get the drift. Okay. And so there's a lot of marriage imagery to talk about the relationship between God and Israel.
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, idolatry, worshiping other gods, is adultery. Because if you're worshiping other gods, you're cheating on God.
Mhm.
Okay. So when you read the Old Testament prophets, this is where the Bible gets difficult. Let's say you crack open Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel and any of the Old Testament prophets, and they talk about adultery. You'd have to really read between the lines and realize it's really not about adultery. It's really about idolatry and
That was this morning.
Israel breaking the covenanted relationship with God. Okay. Now back to the whole 613 thing. If you run with that image or run with that as a way of establishing a relationship, those of you who are married, you don't have to, be honest. But those of you who are married, how many do's and don'ts are there that you need to follow in order to keep the relationship on a good footing?
I've lost track.
They change very often.
Okay. Well, things like thou shalt leave the toilet seat down,
Yeah,
guys. Thou shalt do the dishes at least 3 times a week. Thou shalt put your dirty clothes in the dirty clothes hamper. Right? Thou shalt not stay out too late if you hang out with your soccer buddies on Wednesday nights. You get the drift. Those weren't in your wedding vows, but they probably add up to 613. Or they add up to a lot. Let me just put it to you that way. And like the covenant with God and Israel, if they keep getting broken, there's going to be problems. Right? I mean, that's where that adultery image, really kind of hits home both ways, with God and God's people, and with, between spouses. The purpose of the law, the purpose of the 613 do's and don'ts, is really a blessing because it's meant to preserve the relationship.
And is that so, Pastor, as it being a covenant at that point of time, I'll say the rules and regulations, the do's and don'ts, in order to get protection, versus the covenant of marriage today, which is the joining because of love. Is there a different, it feels like a different type of covenant between what marriage and that covenant would have meant from a protection and rules versus what the marriage covenant means today?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Marriage in the ancient world, you're right, it's kind of a contractual thing, very much a contractual thing.
Yes.
But it's not like there isn't an element of love involved. Abraham loved Sarah, and Jacob loved Rebecca. As a matter of fact, Jacob had to work an extra 7 years in order to get her hand, because he got tricked by Laban, Rebecca's father. It's Rebecca and Leah, if I remember correctly, Jacob's two wives.
Rachel and Leah.
Thank you, Rachel and Leah. So Leah, basically, Jacob fell in love with Rachel, but Leah was older. And so Laban did a switcheroo on the wedding night, and to say the least, Jacob was mad. So anyway, there's that element of love, because the way that Jacob loves Rachel, that's a pure love type relationship. The relationship between God and Israel is a love relationship. That's why God uses the marriage imagery, the spousal imagery. I loved you, I took care of you, you were the apple of my eye. A very common interpretation of the Song of Songs in the Old Testament. If you're not familiar with it, it's a skinny, itty bitty little book, kind of in the middle. It's love poetry. And some passages are used at weddings a lot. Love is stronger than death. You put my love for you it was like a seal on my arm, that kind of thing. An ancient interpretation of that is that it's meant to symbolize the love between God and Israel. In the early Christian era, in early Christianity, they kind of applied that to then Christ and the church. Christ is the bridegroom, the church is the bride. Lots of parables, lots of wedding imagery in the New Testament. Okay, heaven is a never-ending wedding banquet. That's actually probably the most common image of heaven in the New Testament, is a wedding banquet. But anyway, so just again, it's just a way to think about covenants. If you're married, then you can sort of, again, kind of wrap your head around it a little bit and say, okay, yeah, now I kind of get it. You make promises before witnesses. You have to sign a marriage license. Today, that's really more of a civil, legal thing versus a spiritual, religious thing. In our day and age, however, you go back maybe during the colonial era, and the religious documents could serve as civil documents. So interestingly enough, my daughter's 15. She wanted to get a work permit through the school. And so the parents have to sign off for her to get a work permit. She's 15. She's a minor, right? In order to prove her birth, okay, we had to supply a legal document, which could have been a passport, social security card, birth certificate, or a baptismal certificate.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? That still in the year 2021, baptismal certificates can still be recognized for the purposes of legal identification that this person is your child or is under your guardianship, or however you want to put it. Isn't that kind of interesting? I thought that was fascinating. The sad thing is I can put my hands on her social security card, photocopy of her birth certificate, and her passport, but I don't know where her baptismal certificate is. But anyway, but you kind of get the drift there. 613 commandments to preserve the covenant with Israel and God. It sounds like a lot. The reality is once you kind of think about it a little bit differently, then it's kind of like, okay, now I get it. You know, I sum up my 613 with me and my wife as yes, dear. Okay, those two little words, you know, sum up all the commandments. Now, the rabbis had a debate of whether or not you could boil the 613 down, whether you could narrow them down. And the consensus ended up being do justly and walk humbly with your God. So boil it down to 2, or you could boil it down to 1. The righteous will live by faithfulness. And so there was a little kind of debate about that among the rabbis with commandments. All right, back to covenants. Any questions about that? Thoughts? Helpful at all? A little bit?
Yeah.
We talk about relationship with God. Well, what's that mean? You know, is God sort of this sort of invisible force of nature? Yes. Or is God also personal and walks and talks with me? Yes. So in what does relationship with God mean? Okay. How do we wrap our heads around that? How do we live into that? How do we think about it? Covenant is one way of sort of approaching that. All right. Last week, I had talked about, you know, how many covenants there are, the first covenant being with Noah. So if you got a Bible there with you, crack it open to Genesis. And we can look at the first couple of chapters just to sort of get an idea. And again, when you read the Bible, it kind of helps to think in big picture stuff. If you get lost in the weeds, then sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. Okay. Genesis chapter 1, the forest is God creates everything, the universe, stars, sun, moon, trees, earthworms, ticks. I wish God didn't create them. All right. And he did it all in 7 days. Actually, no, I'm sorry. He did it all in 6 days. 7th day, God rested. And what was God's verdict on creation and the creation of humanity?
It was good.
It was good. It was very good. Okay. So that's God's intent for creation, is that it's good and it's very good. And then, you know, God, the story approaches it from a different point of view in Genesis 2, in chapter 3 with Adam, you know, an individual person. And Adam needs a companion. And so God creates the animals as companions for Adam. Even though chapter 1, the animals are created first. Chapter 2, they're created second. So don't try to reconcile the two. Don't try to make them fit. Just understand that they're two separate stories with two separate points. All right. again, big picture, the forest is God's creating humanity to be in relationship and to have relationships. All right. And it's based on one thing: do what you're told. And Adam and Eve don't do what they're told. Really, that's kind of what it boils down to. You can do anything you want except eat from this one tree. And lo and behold, they eat from that tree and all hell breaks loose. Serpent tricks them, okay? And then you get the consequences of the disobedience. You know, God still loves them, but there's got to be consequences. And so they get kicked out of the garden. The tree of knowledge of good and evil has all kinds of nasty side effects, okay? And really, for the sake of the garden, God kicks them out. Otherwise, all those nasty side effects would probably destroy the garden. You know what I mean? You can kind of think, just sort of think through the side effects of the disobedience, or the effects of the disobedience, and the consequences. You might think, well, gee, God was a little extreme there, don't you think? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But again, just kind of think about it. Chapter 4, you get the first murder. Chapter 5, you know, lots of people are you know, humanity just kind of spreads. Chapter 6, you get even more disobedience. Now it's angels or heavenly beings sleeping with earthly women. Okay. The earth was corrupt in God's sight. The earth was filled with violence. This is chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 11. You even back up a little bit. God has nothing good to say. Verse 5, 6:5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humanity was great in the earth. Every inclination of their hearts was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made humanity on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Wow. I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in his sight. Earth was corrupt in God's sight. The earth was filled with violence. God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. So, I mean, this is kind of where, you know, if you want to like chew on it for a while, like, I mean, what leaps out? I mean, if you just stopped halfway through chapter 6, what do you think is going to happen?
All is over.
Yeah.
It's a very short Bible at that point.
Yeah, we're not here to read it.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, I mean, you sort of, again, like the themes that kind of run through: violence, evil inclination of the heart. I mean, you know, it's kind of hard to make sense of what's going on with the sons of God, which is interpreted as angels, saw that women were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for their flesh, their days shall be 120 years. And then you have the Nephilim, were on the earth in those days. Sons of God went into the daughters of humans, bore children to them. They were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. I mean, what the heck?
It makes you think about today's world, how
How so?
corrupt,
Oh, corruption?
how corrupt everything is. And, you listen to the news and, the city of brotherly love, every day there's a shooting, and how violent everybody is, and you think, how does God feel about all of this? All this hate that people have in their hearts,
Yeah.
and you just wait to see if somebody's building an ark down the street, it's like,
Yeah.
because I mean, the world is really an evil place right now. And, I keep looking around.
Maybe you're supposed to build the ark, Joyce.
Oh, is that why I'm collecting all these tools?
Oh, okay. I thought you were saving money to get up to the International Space Station.
Yeah, me and Bill Shatner.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, violence, corruption, the interpretation of the angels sleeping with women and creating these sort of species isn't the right word, like group of demigods almost, like Hercules. Okay. A lot of ancient civilizations had myths of a demigod.
Mhm.
And so that's not really unusual, but in Genesis, it's kind of looked at kind of askance a little bit, to say the least. So God decides the earth was good, and now it's not. And so God decides to clean the slate, clean everything up. You get the flood story, kind of a return to the way God intended things with Noah, Noah and his family, the only righteous people around. All right. Like I talked about last week, you expand the whole Noah and Noah's children, and it's all humanity. Everyone is related to Noah. When you think of it in those terms. The people in China, the people in Australia, everyone living in South Africa, Chile, the Eskimos in Alaska, we're all related to Noah. Okay. And so God makes a covenant with Noah and Noah's children, and there's the word, use that word covenant. Okay. And this is sort of how God reestablishes a good relationship with humanity. Never again will I wipe the earth out with a flood. Puts a rainbow in the clouds. Make sense? All right. Now, just to kind of talk about the image a little bit more and then talk about why that's important biblically. Can I be the host so I can share my screen real quick?
Sure.
Thank you.
There you go.
Great, thank you. All right. So do y'all remember how I mentioned that last week the image is to cut a covenant? Y'all remember that?
Mhm.
Right. And that literally means it's carved in stone. So here are some images of ancient writing. They didn't have paper 2,000 years ago, but they had clay. And they would literally cut, it's called cuneiform. They would literally, can y'all see that?
Mhm.
I know a couple of you are on phones and you might not be able to see it, but they would take a little stick that had a sharp edge to it and they would mash into the clay and do letters. and stuff. And so it's called cuneiform. Ancient, 3,000-year-old writing. This is what they did way back when.
Ooh.
And you literally cut the words, and they're pretty permanent. Okay. Or one of the earliest forms of writing, because they didn't have paper in the Middle East, wasn't invented yet. Which is really, think about that. Paper wasn't even invented yet. And yet here's humanity like writing in clay. It's just unbelievable to me. It's just absolutely amazing. So then you have lawgivers. Okay. One of the oldest is called the Code of Hammurabi. Y'all ever heard of the Code of Hammurabi?
Mm-hmm.
It's something like, I don't know, 4,000 years old or something like that. It was written on this big 6-foot tall slab of black granite, kind of pretty highly polished. And you can't really see it there, but let me see if there's a way to blow up the image a little bit. I don't think there is. Here, let me try this. So anyway, you blow up the image a little bit, and here's that writing carved in stone. The Code of Hammurabi is a law. It's all the laws that the god, here's the god's the one sitting down, Marduk, giving it to Hammurabi, the king, who's then going to enact the god's laws. Sound familiar? And it's carved in stone, literally. You cut the covenant. And this is the covenant, the law between God and back then, I think this was not Sumerian. I think the Code of Hammurabi might be Sumerian. Now the laws, the covenants, usually come with obligations. The God promises certain things, and because it's the God's kind of sort of unilateral about it, and the humanity, the underlings, so to speak, in order to preserve the relationship, have to do certain things. Okay. With Noah, you've got this is chapter 9. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Last time you heard "be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth" was Genesis chapter 1. Remember, creation, good, very good.
Mm-hmm.
The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. Okay. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Okay. So Noah and his sons are not vegetarian. Or actually, they could be vegetarian, but they're allowed to eat flesh. Okay. However, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal, I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. And then it goes on about the blood. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made mankind. Okay. The first murder. Abel, Cain and Abel, the Cain and Abel story.
Mm-hmm.
God knows what's going on because Abel's blood is crying out from the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa. And again, if you go back to Genesis 6, okay, violence. You know, Joyce, you mentioned the murder rate in Philly, right? This whole idea about blood. And so, so there's sort of a commandment there. Now, interestingly enough, anyone here ever have blood sausage?
No.
Anyone know what blood sausage is?
What is this?
I had it twice in Ireland.
Yeah.
They literally made sausage and they used the blood to sort of make the sausage. It looked really gross, but it tasted really good. That would be violating the covenant with Noah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's Megan. Can you just repeat what you just said about you were in Ireland and what you ate and what it was made of? And just say that one more time.
It was called blood sausage. They made sausage and blood was an ingredient. And it looked really kind of funky, but it tasted pretty good. And according to the Old Testament, you do not eat the blood. So that would have been in violation of the covenant with Noah. It's one of those kosher laws also within Judaism. Not to eat the blood. The blood is sacred. You have to pour it out.
So is that-
or drain. You have to drain the carcass, has to be drained of its blood because the blood is God's.
So is that an endorsement of well done meat?
Maybe.
I mean, I've read it a bunch of times and it always strikes me as, well, okay, if I have a medium rare steak, am I like it from a Jewish perspective, would that be considered unclean?
Probably not, because if the meat was butchered in a kosher way, then you're probably good. It's not like you're actually eating the blood, or the blood is actually a part, like an ingredient in the food.
Okay,
Now, if you have a bacon wrapped steak, that would be a problem.
well, yes, because it's bacon.
Right. Yeah. No pork products. Kosher laws against pork products.
So you were host with the sausage to begin with.
Yes, but then you have the New Testament, which does different things with food laws and all that other
Right.
stuff. Anyway, all right. So God makes a covenant with Noah and his sons and his descendants. Okay. So the question is sometimes gets asked, if God picked Israel, Abraham, that's chapter 12, okay, to have a special relationship with, what about all those other poor schmucks out there in the world? Anyone ever wonder that?
Mm-hmm.
How does God have a relationship with, people on a desert island somewhere in the South Pacific, if they've never heard of God? Does God recognize them? Or, how does that work? The thing to take home about the covenant with Noah is that they have a relationship with God through this covenant with Noah. Because again, Noah is the ancestor of all those people on that desert island in the South Pacific. Does that make sense? I have a hunch. My guess is we rarely, if ever, think about it in those terms. Am I right about that? What do y'all think?
Yeah, I had never considered that.
So Noah came after Abraham, right?
No, Noah's before Abraham.
Oh, okay. Because I was thinking about Abraham's son with the handmaid, Ishmael.
Yeah, Hagar. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that-
Ishmael, yeah.
He was the head of the Arab nations, right? Ishmael. Hence
Yep.
some of the trouble between the Arabs and the Hebrews. But so Noah would have wiped all that away?
No.
No, it was before all
Oh,
that.
Noah's before all that. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So they're all ultimately from Noah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Noah was before.
So what do y'all think? How does
So the
that?
covenant exist even for those that are not aware the covenant exists.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Or maybe they do have an awareness, but their awareness is shaped by 2,000 years of a different culture, thousands of years of being separated in time and space and distance and location from other people. I mean, if you want to get really philosophical about it, you could sort of run with the observation that every culture on the planet has some sort of religion. I mean, atheism is a relatively recent phenomenon, believe it or not, in the strict sense of the word. Pretty much every culture has some sort of religion, however you want to define it. Whether it's the spirit of your ancestors or, the god of the ocean or the god of the sky or, you know what I mean? Now, is God, is the God that we know through the Bible and through Jesus Christ speaking through those other gods? Maybe. But either way, the biblical God says that he has a relationship with those people. Kind of like you said, Clark, they might not know it, but we've been told that he does.
So their God is our God.
Maybe the other way around.
Our God is their God.
Yeah.
Why did you say it may be the other way around? I mean, is it,
Well, yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's kind of, if it's one and it's just seen through a different cultural evolution.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Right. So the reason why I would sort of say it's sort of really more our God is theirs, because as Christians, if we feel like we know who God is in truth, in spirit and in truth, through Jesus Christ, then it's kind of like, hey, it's sort of like this. Here's a metaphor. Someone might know my grandma, might be acquainted with my grandma, but they don't know my grandma the way I know my grandma. You see what I mean? So they're in a relationship with my grandma, but I have a deeper relationship with my grandma. And so, yeah, they might know Mary Price, but you're in a relationship with Mary Price, who loves cats, wore purple, that kind of thing. Whereas they might not know that part of Mary Price at all. Whereas we as Christians, and Jews would say this too, there's that special revelation that's gone on. Now, that doesn't mean that God hasn't spoken to everybody at some point and in some way. Not to get lost in the weeds with that idea, but when you get into the New Testament, especially the book of Acts, when Paul starts to do his mission to Gentiles, they're not Jewish. They don't care about being Jewish. They don't care about the Jewish God. And Paul's like, that doesn't really matter in the end. What does matter is that God has picked someone to be judge of the living and the dead by raising him from the dead, Jesus Christ. And so you get kind of this weird philosophical argument in Acts 17, where Paul says, you Greeks, even some of your own poets talk about this God in whom we live and move and have our being, in whom we live and move and have our human existence. Y'all recognize the divine living inside of you in that way. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about that. the God who is the God of every living thing, including koala bears in Australia, okay, has chosen someone who I'm about to tell you about and raised him from the dead. And the Greeks, the Athenians, are like, oh, that's kind of interesting. They didn't have any questions about anything else, but they had questions about the resurrection. And they said, we'll ask you a little bit more about the resurrection later on. And so you sort of, you can find you can find that idea that in between the lines of the Old Testament.
Okay.
Now, as far as a formal relationship with God and humanity, it's in its most formal with Noah. And the ancient Jewish attitude was, well, okay, if you live in accordance with God's covenant with Noah, then, you know, you're good with God. And so the rabbis came up with a general idea of 7 commandments, all right, that are a part of the covenant with Noah. And it's prohibitions against idolatry, blasphemy, bloodshed. There's the violence part. Incest and adultery. That has to do a little bit with the whole angels and women thing. Okay. Robbery, and the injunction to establish courts of law, because the world of Noah before the flood was lawless. All right. And the prohibition against eating flesh cut from a living animal. That's, you know, the whole blood thing again. Now, in case you're wondering where that came from, believe it or not, I found this for free on a bookshelf somewhere at the seminary. It's the Jewish Publication Society's commentary on Genesis. So it's a commentary by rabbis on Genesis, and it explains things that you won't find in other commentaries. Now, the ancient Jewish idea is, okay, you know, you kind of live with these basic natural laws, then you have a good relationship with God and a share in the life to come. So, you know, the people on the desert island in the middle of the South Pacific, as long as they're not cannibals, okay, they're good with God. Judaism, for that reason, really hasn't been a big religion when it comes to proselytizing, evangelizing. Of the world's religions, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are probably the 3 biggest when it comes to evangelization historically. Judaism, not so much, because there really wasn't a pressing need for it necessarily. Does that make sense? What does that look like in the New Testament? It's Peter talking to a Gentile, Cornelius, in Acts chapter 10. And his whole speech starts off with, I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, including India and Peru, well, maybe not Peru, because they practiced human sacrifice. The ancient Incas did. So maybe not Peru. All right. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. If you just sort of take that statement on face value, then that's the argument. Well, okay, I'm a good person. Am I going to heaven? Kinda. I'm not one to judge. Does that make sense? And the reason why I'm beating the dead horse on this is I think we hear these things in our culture and society all the time. Well, you know, you just got to be a good person. Well, I don't go to church because I don't feel the need to. You know, I think God is fine with me if I'm just a good person. No, okay. I mean, there's really more to it than that. Peter doesn't end his speech there, by the way. He keeps going, but that's how he opens his speech to this Gentile. And it's in Holy Scripture, right? So, what do we do with that? And what about all those people who died before they ever had a chance to hear about who Jesus is? These are the types of questions that I hear all the time that people, it might not necessarily impact their faith, but it certainly does. It sets their thinking on a certain trajectory. It's not necessarily bad because I'm not necessarily going to judge it, but where does it come from? And what do we do with it? Is that helpful at all? I've been talking way too much. What do y'all think of that? Or y'all busy thinking about it? I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, it's stuff to ponder.
That it is. That it is. Now Peter goes on with his speech, and you can kind of anticipate where he's going to go. People in every nation, anyone who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee. After the baptism that John announced, God anointed Jesus with the Holy Spirit and with power, went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil. We are witnesses of all that took place, both in Judea and Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to everybody, but to us who are chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that Jesus is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. So in spite of the fact that God shows no partiality, and that every people in every nation who fear him, the witnesses, us, because we too are witnesses, preach to the people and testify that Jesus is ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead, forgiveness of sins. Go back to the end of Luke's gospel. Jesus says, you will be my witnesses. And your message is going to be repent and receive the forgiveness of sins, or something like that. Is all this kind of ringing bells, by the way? My goal is to help make connections, trying to kind of make connections with stuff that you've probably heard for years, maybe read in the Bible, things that, I don't want to say slogans that kind of lodge in people's heads, but they're there. And how do you connect them into a larger whole that makes sense?
Yeah, things are coming together for me.
Good. All right. Questions, comments? All right. Y'all sure?
All right.
It's 8 o'clock. Do you want to chew on that and sleep on it for a week?
Yeah, there's a lot to digest there.
Yeah.
And I mean, you jumped us 4,000 years from the covenant with Noah to Peter and the Gentiles, and tying the beginning and the end together there. So there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, it ties together. It ties. It's just it's probably not what I would have picked up when I read Peter's words and thought about what I read about Noah.
Right. I'll leave y'all with one last little anecdote. So Christianity is a missionary religion. It's a missionary religion. Christianity, Jesus said, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. Go, make disciples. That's the end of Matthew's gospel. And to Luke's gospel. Go, you will be my witnesses, beginning here in Jerusalem and Samaria to the ends of the earth, proclaiming to the nations, all right, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name, to all nations. So, when Christianity spread out into parts of the world that were very different, like outside the Roman Empire, like all those Gothic tribes in Northern Europe, and when they went, down south, down the Nile into Ethiopia, and tradition has it that St. Thomas made his way to India and is supposedly buried on the shore of the Arabian Sea in southern India. Okay. The history of early Christianity is a history of adapting to other cultures. What that means, or what that ended up meaning, is learning the language of that culture, learning some of their lifestyle stuff, in a couple cases, kind of turning a blind eye on some sketchy practices, like having more than one wife, that kind of thing. Translating the Bible into other languages and other concepts. Now that's kind of interesting. The Russian alphabet, by the way, was invented by two Greek Orthodox monks when they went to translate the New Testament into Russian, or Slavic rather. When missionaries made it to China in the year 600 or so, they used Buddhist and Taoist terms and tried to translate the New Testament using Buddhist and Taoist concepts, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. I mean, that's an ancient culture right there. In the 1500s, when European missionaries went back to China, the Chinese, by the way, wiped out Christianity in the 800s and 900s. But when Christian missionaries went back in the 1500s, they dressed up like Chinese scholars. The Chinese culture engaged in all kinds of religious practices honoring your ancestors. Some people thought that was worshiping your ancestors. They kind of took a more favorable view on it and said, no, it's respecting your ancestors. It's not actual worship. And so there was some controversy around that. When they translated John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we've seen his glory as the glory of Father's only Son. Okay. That'll be read on Christmas Eve. They translated in the beginning was the Word. They translated that as Tao. In the beginning was the Tao. Ancient Chinese concept. So it's fascinating to me. To me, it's just fascinating. The way we as Christians have kind of adapted our message and acknowledge and respect how God has spoken to other people in other cultures. Now, the interesting thing about China, by the way, to bring it all the way up to 2021, I don't know if y'all follow the news, or every now and then I'll see a headline about a controversy within the Roman Catholic Church in China today. Okay. The Chinese government wants to have some say over who the new archbishops will be. Can you see where this is headed? All right. And so the Chinese government is leaning on Pope Francis and the Vatican to appoint certain people. Meanwhile, the history has been that the bishops are appointed and elected by the Council of Bishops in China. So you have Chinese Catholics, and you have one faction that's wanting to conform more to the government and not get persecuted by the government by letting the government have a say in who the archbishops are going to be. And you have another faction within Chinese Catholicism to say, no, we want to appoint our own bishops and elect our own bishops from among ourselves, even if they're going to get persecuted by the government. All of that goes back a couple hundred years to the Chinese Christianity's relationship with the Vatican, going back to the 1700s. It's interesting, really, really interesting. Anyway, that's the last little tidbit I'm going to leave with y'all. And it's after 8 o'clock now. So y'all can kind of chew on that stuff and think about it, and just know that God loves you.
You too.
Thank you, Joyce.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that.
right.
Anything else? All right, y'all are going to chew on that. And then next week, I'm going to let y'all do all the talking, asking questions, and offering feedback and thoughts and things that occur to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night, y'all.